Well, it is the most exciting time of the year to be a Supercars fan. In just a few days' time, we will be witnessing the 2024 edition of the Repco Bathurst 1000, Australia's great race. And I'm here to cover everything you need to know before the cars hit the track. And if you're new to Supercars or just trying to get into the championship all year long, I cover it with news videos, round previews and reviews, and loads of other good stuff in between. And I'd appreciate your support by subscribing to the channel. But let's get stuck into this amazing weekend of racing that's ahead of us, starting of course with this magnificent piece of a racetrack, Mount Panorama. It's playing host to round 10 of this year's championship. It's technically a street circuit. There's private residences along this amazing strip of road, and it's located just outside the Bathurst township in New South Wales. To put that in context, it's about a 2.5-hour drive east of the Sydney CBD. It's a beautiful part of the world. I highly recommend visiting if you haven't had the chance to do so. And the circuit is just unmatched. It's 6.2 kilometers or 3.8 miles in an anti-clockwise direction with 23 brutal corners, and as a result, the risk rating around here is extreme. Let's understand why this place is so challenging with a virtual lap in Assetto Corsa. Now, full disclosure, I'm in a GT4 Spec Camaro in this footage, so it's got traction control, ABS, a bit more downforce than the boys have this weekend, but it does give us a good tour of the venue, including Hell Corner, the first turn, a 90-degree left-hander. So important to get a good exit here because you need that traction and exit speed to get a good run up mountain straights, which we're on now. If you don't get that turn one correct, you feel the pain all along this stretch of road to start your 6K lap. You crest over the hill there, the revs often spike there, and then you size up turn 2. Griffin's Bend, this is where it really starts to narrow up. The Supercars guys don't tend to use that inside curb that much, but they do run it nice and wide to maximize the exit speed. And now you're entering the cutting, braking and turning at the same time. So easy to lose the car here. And then on the exit, you've got to watch out for the wall on the right hand side as well. Now we're starting the real climb of the mountain. We're nearly at the peak actually, which is at this next corner through Reid Park. Once again, watching that outside wall, we often see big slides through there in the top 10 shooter, and now down by the Great through Suleiman Park, playing chicken with yet another concrete wall on the right hand side, and now into McPhillamy. The car always gets unstable through there, and just by the time you settled it, you're plunging down through Brock Skyline. Down the SSI, run a bit wide there, but managed to catch it. You're turning, you're braking, you're downshifting. There's so much going on in this part of the track, and now you wind your way down the mountain to Forest Elbow, a really important corner, but one that gives you understeer, which kills your exit speed. That is so important because now you find yourself on Conrod Straight. One of the few parts of the track where you can take a breather, although it's got a fair amount of undulation. It's actually really dramatic to see the cars disappear below the camera line with some of the hills on this back stretch. You're approaching 300 kilometers an hour as you start sizing up the chase. Full throttle through here, although you need to get on the anchors as soon as the car straightens up. Down here at the chase, a really big overtaking zone. On the exit, it's all about flow and rhythm. Watch for any cars re-entering on the right side if they've gone off. And now you've just got one more corner to go. Although we do see dramas down here with brake locking. It's another 90-degree left-hander though to finish up the lap. Big curbs on the inside and the outside, and you've just got to do that 160 more times. Now, in all my round previews throughout the year, I like to include what I call spots to watch. Parts of each racetrack that I think generate the most excitement and drama for you to either sit at if you're trackside or keep your eyes peeled for on TV. When it comes to Bathurst though, I mean, how do you narrow it down? The whole place just generates drama. There are a few areas I want to shout out ahead of this year's great race. The first one is Reid Park, up under that tree, the tip of the hill. I do think we'll see even bigger slides there compared to 12 months ago, given the fact that we're no longer on the soft, we're back on the hard tire, and combined with the less downforce that Gen 3 cars have compared to Gen 2 a few years ago, I think we'll see some pretty cool shots at this part of the racetrack. I think we'll see similar moments at McPhillamy Park, because even last year at this famous part of Bathurst, we did see some big snaps up there by the gravel trap, and given the fact again they're on that harder compounded tire, I think we'll be seeing even more of that this year. My final spot to watch is the chase. Obviously in the race itself, it's a big overtaking spot. It's always a hold your breath moment on lap 1, especially when they're in a big pack. But in qualifying, I feel like this is just as dramatic, especially in the top 10 shootout, because it's right towards the end of the lap. It's such a challenging corner, it's such a high-speed entry, it's such a big braking zone, and it's right at the end of the lap. I mean, how much pressure must the drivers feel? Going down Conrod, they've done a perfect top 10 shootout lap to that point, and they know they've got to get this one right. I really do love that suspense that builds in those 15 or so seconds while they're sizing this corner up. Now, how about we size up the weekend schedule? When are supercars on track? Well, it gets underway on Thursday with the first practice session at 1:20 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. Later that evening, you have the second practice and final one of the Thursday, and that will be dedicated just for the co-drivers. First thing on Friday, we actually have something a bit different, a bit unique. There's a dedicated test session, I understand, to test the prototype Dunlop tyres that are expected to be introduced for 2025. Fingers crossed that goes well, because it sounds like they could be a really promising compound for the championship to switch to. Practice 3 follows at 10:05 a.m. and then you've got practice 4 later that afternoon before the all-important qualifying that gets underway at 4:15 p.m. Moving into Saturday, we have another practice session just for the co-drivers, then an all-open practice session in the afternoon, practice 6, before the top 10 shootout, one of my favorite parts of the weekend, that gets underway at 5:05 p.m. Then finally on Sunday, we have a warm-up in the morning. The drivers definitely don't want to make a mistake during that session, because the race, the great race, that gets underway shortly after at 11:30 a.m. on Sunday. 161 laps of Bathurst will follow. If you're one of the 200,000 fans heading trackside, I've got great news for you on the weather front. At the time of recording, it's looking like really nice conditions. Partly cloudy for all 4 days and hovering between max temps of 20 and 25 degrees. That being said, it is in the Blue Mountains, Bathurst. The weather can change in a flash, so definitely still keep your eyes on the sky as the weekend rolls on. So what have been the key headlines since the last event at Sandown? Well, how do you go past Toyota? The biggest announcement in supercars in so many years. They will be joining the championship in 2026 with the Supra. Huge news for the sport, and I've done a dedicated video talking about their entry in the coming years, so be sure to check that one out after this preview. Toyota will be at the mountain this weekend though, interacting with fans. They're also going to have a full-scale clay model of the Gen 3 Supra, which will be our first real early look at what that race car should look like. In other news, the 2025 Supercars calendar has been announced. I would say it's a small step in the right direction. The rounds have been reshuffled to some more logical points of the year when it comes to weather. We've also got an extra round, and the real curiosity is the final series. It looks like supercars are going to take inspiration from NASCAR to a degree and have a almost playoff few rounds at the final stages of the year. So I'll discuss more of that when we know more details following on from Bathurst, so keep an eye out for that video very soon. Meanwhile, on the driver front, Tim Slade has announced he will retire from full-time driving at the end of this year. Richie Stanaway has been linked with that seat, although it's not confirmed at the time of recording. On the business front, Mark Skaife has stepped down from his positions on the race and supercars boards. The TV negotiations are happening at the moment for the next TV rights deal, and given he's both a commentator and plays roles on the business front, he had to remove that conflict of interest. I personally suspect that once the negotiations are all complete, he'll probably go back on those boards in some sort of capacity, but time will tell. And then finally, the Supercars CEO Shane Howard admitted that they plan to chase Ricciardo about a potential Supercars drive, most likely in a wild card at some point in the future. I personally think that's a little bit ambitious, although Speed Cafe reported today that Valtteri Bottas has admitted he would love to race in the series at some point, so maybe he's the F1 star they should be chasing. How about Gen 3 watch? We've had these cars for almost 2 years now, and they just continue to evolve. They continue to throw up surprises and headaches, and it just seems to rumble on. And that was certainly the case after Sandown. We had massive reliability concerns for the Ford engines with a crankshaft issue that took a couple of cars out in the race, and then a few more actually at the ride day following the event. They've identified the problem. They're flying in the replacement parts from all over the world. In fact, they're GT3 parts, and they're going to be fitting them to the cars throughout the weekend. Fingers crossed they all have those updated parts in the engines by the time Sunday rolls around. We're also waiting for news on any potential parity adjustments. It's being long awaited and suspected that there would be some tweaks to the engine performance in either the Camaro or the Mustang, or both, ahead of the Bathurst 1000. We haven't heard anything at the time of recording. That could change by the time I release this video, but I'm waiting with bated breath to see if anything changes there. Of course, it's going to be controversial no matter what happens. And then finally, there's been a change to the fuel flow ahead of this weekend's racing at Bathurst. They actually upgraded the fuel system at Sandown to make sure they could fill the cars up a little bit faster, because pit stops at last year's Enduros just took too long. They've clearly excelled though. They've deemed that the fuel flow rate is too fast, and it's now outpacing the ability of the drivers to do their swaps and the teams to change different things like the brakes. For me, I love that challenge. I think that should be a factor for the teams to overcome, but they have restricted the fuel flow just a little bit to give them more breathing room. So let's chat about some of the storylines on track this weekend. Firstly, Boost Mobile have upped the prize money for getting pole position. I think that makes perfect sense. At a grueling track like Bathurst with so many people watching, the pole sitter will win 15,000 Australian dollars if they take that front row start. In other news, of course, I've mentioned the hard tyre. I'm so pleased to see that they're using that again this year. It should hopefully lead to a far more interesting race than what we saw 12 months ago, because the drivers should be able to push hard like they should at Bathurst, including over the top, which obviously involves a lot of risk. If we do see wet weather, there's a intermediate tyre available to the teams as well. It's the first time in a long time, if ever, to the best of my knowledge, an intermediate's being available, and this is to help tackle the differing conditions you can have at Bathurst between the top of the mountain and the bottom. But based on the weather forecast, I don't think we're going to see it play much of a role. Obviously, following Sandown, the main drivers are required to start the Great Race this year. If you haven't been following the championship in recent months, this is a big rule change. Normally we see the co-drivers start at Bathurst, but Supercars have mandated that the main guys are in the hot seat, and I personally actually am quite open to it. I do feel like it will lead to a far more action-packed opening stint, but it does have the negative side of reducing some strategic options. We'll see how it plays out and know whether it was the right or wrong decision in a few days' time. Of course, Bathurst is never one alone. We've got the co-drivers, but we've also got the teams, and pit stops will be a huge focus this weekend, as they always are at the Enduros. I haven't been able to see it in the regs, but I strongly suspect teams are still required to do a brake change throughout the race as well. And we know that caused a few issues for the teams last year, so I'm curious to see if that crops up as a curveball in 2024. If you haven't been following Supercars throughout this year, they actually introduced a full course yellow system similar to what we see in Formula One, although it has needed quite a bit of refinement. There have been some further changes ahead of this year's Great Race. They've upped the minimum speed limit for that one after it ironically caused an accident at Sandown, and they've also removed the promise of having it out for a minimum number of laps. That was a problem at Sandown because it meant that we had really long caution periods, and it also meant that the element of risk was removed for the teams because they no longer had to double stack their drivers in the pit lane. Fortunately, they have refined that. Fingers crossed they've landed in a sweet spot, because yeah, those long caution periods were certainly not something we wanted to see this weekend. All right, let's round this out with some predictions. As always, I'm just throwing things out there and seeing what sticks. Don't take these too seriously, although I do try to share my reasoning and logic behind each prediction. Starting off with the winner, I'm going for an outsider. I'm going to say Matthew Payne and Garth Tander. Now, Garth Tander has obviously won the race on multiple occasions. He's such a safe pair of hands around that track. And Matt Payne, while he's young, I feel like when he's in the zone and comfortable, he can be one of the fastest out there. He is still very young though, still very inexperienced, so that may come to bite him this weekend. Only time will tell. My second prediction is that one of the top three in the championship will DNF. So that's Brown, Moster, or Feeney. I hope this doesn't happen because I'd like to see the championship go down to the wire, but we know Bathurst doesn't always guarantee fairy tales. And my final prediction is that at least one car will be withdrawn from the race. They'll have an accident either on Thursday, Friday, or Saturday. That will unfortunately mean they don't start the great race. Hopefully not, but I've got a gut feeling someone might bite the dust. Thank you as always for some of your predictions. First one here from SC787 saying Pi will have a crash or a moment at the top of the mountain. This is a really good talking point because, man, the pressure on all the co-drivers is big, but can you imagine what it's like for those co-drivers with the top three in the championship? Not only do they not want to make a mistake that could cost the great race, a mistake could cost their driver and team the championship. So the co-drivers for those top three will certainly feel the pressure this weekend. We'll see how they go. The second prediction here from Pelicans, more of a question actually. If Lowndes in the wild card is leading from Jamie Whincup and Feeney, does Jamie Whincup as team principal call team orders to let the second car through? This is a really interesting situation. Honestly, I know Jamie Whincup is a divisive figure, but I don't think they would. I reckon they would let Lowndes take that win or at least fight for it on fair terms. It would be such a good PR story, even if it does introduce a curveball in the championship and obviously cost Feeney his shot. And to be honest, I think he'd want to win it on merit anyway. But yeah, that would be a very unique set of circumstances if we see that situation this weekend. And then finally from Black Azza saying, I predict Skippy will make a return to the track. We didn't see him last year. I don't think we've seen him on the track for a few years, which is just as well because we don't like seeing the wildlife get hurt. But yes, it can be a factor at Bathurst. We've had kangaroos, we've even had echidnas, so we'll see if anything crops up in 2024. Here's a quick snapshot of the championship. Will Brown has a fairly good lead in the championship, but he certainly can't afford for a big mistake in the coming events. Chas Mostert's been closing the gap in second, while Brock Feeney is in third. And if you want to look at the rest of the order, you can pause this video. On the team's front, it's a bit more locked away. Red Bull are certainly stealing a charge at the front of this year's team's championship. Tickford are in second and WAU in third. Finally, let's not forget there's some amazing support categories on track this weekend. Bathurst is not just about the supercars, there's so much racing action from dawn to dusk. And we've got the Dunlop series. This is like the Formula 2 of supercars, if you will, the young up-and-comers. They'll be racing around the mountain. The V8 Super Utes, my guilty pleasure. Porsche Carrera Cup, if you like your racing a bit more refined, they'll be on track as well. The GR Cup as well, the Toyota 86s will be in action with lots of young drivers in that one too. And then finally, 55 cars in the V8 Sleuth Heritage Revival, cars from all eras of supercars and before. I'm really excited to see how those races roll out. I do suspect we might see a safety car or two for reliability, but just seeing those cars on track will be incredibly special. And special is probably the right word to wind this one up because, I mean, how else can you explain Bathurst? If you did want to know more about the drivers and some of their stories and forms so far this year, I've done a dedicated video talking about every entry in this year's great race. And of course, I would love your thoughts down there in the comments below. Predictions, what you love about Bathurst, all those sorts of things. Would love to hear it. Just remember to treat people like your trackside. In the meantime, have a fantastic weekend of racing. I'll put a poll up or two if something interesting happens that I want your thoughts on, so keep an eye out for those. And yes, happy Bathurst Day for when Sunday rolls around, and I cannot wait to talk about it once the great race has been run and won.